Obviously, I want to start with the watermelon portion of this project because I have to base things around that in terms of size. As you can see, I'm just comparing the shapes of the walnuts that I have here, just because I want to get one that is watermelon shaped, if that makes sense. I want one that has a nice rounded end rather than one that is more pointy like some walnuts are. So after I selected the walnut that I wanted, I brought out my knives because when you crack open a walnut, obviously there's the meat and then there's like the inner structure around it. And I pulled out the majority of that when I first opened this one, but there's still some around the edges that you just want to tidy up and like not have there. That being said, you do have to be very careful that you don't accidentally trim off too much from the sides, because walnuts fit together in a particular way that is individual to each one, and if you trim off too much, then they won't fit together perfectly like you want. So along the way, I kept fitting them together and making sure that they still fit like they should until I was happy. Obviously, I am painting the walnut shell to resemble watermelon, but first I have to start with a white base coat so I don't have to apply a million layers of my watermelon paint. Otherwise, the walnut shell will show through and it is very frustrating. I also did a base coat on the inside of each walnut half, which turned out not to be necessary. And then I just mixed the paint using this Kelly green paint, white paint, and yellow paint to create a kind of pistachio color. I found this chunk of floral foam in my craft stash, and I thought that it would be perfect for creating the inner texture that a watermelon has. So I cut out this shape for the inside, and I kept having to trim it because I wasn't real exact in the beginning, but that's okay. But eventually I did get it to the shape I wanted, and then I trimmed out the inside of it so that I could put another piece behind and kind of make it more 3D, and it was just a lot simpler to do it that way. Once I had it like that, then I glued it in with Elmer's glue. Then I took little chunks of floral foam and kind of stuffed them in the cracks where they didn't fit, just so that it fit even better. Then I just used my dotting tool and some other clay tools to kind of rough up the foam and blend everything together, just so that it continues to give that watermelon texture and not floral foam. For some reason, I was concerned about the green showing through my eventual paint job of red, so I took some water and put some white paint in it to create a kind of wash for this, so that it would hopefully cancel out some of the green there in the foam. This did turn out to be unnecessary later on, but I would rather be safe than sorry, so I applied one coat on camera and then another one off camera just to make sure I had my bases covered. So then, after that was dry, I brought out my red paint so that I could paint it red, because obviously that's the inside of a watermelon. Also, I do want to apologize because I was sick last week, and that means my voice is not quite back to normal. I did try to wait until I was better to record the voiceover, and that's why the video is a little bit later than I would have liked, but eventually I just had to get on with it. And after making sure everything was thoroughly dry, I took a pencil and used it to mark the watermelon stripes on the outer shell of the walnut, just so that I would kind of have a guideline to know where to put the darker green paint, and then hopefully there would have to be less touch-ups afterwards. For the watermelon stripes, I just started out using this basic dark English ivy green, but then later on, after painting a few stripes, I decided it wasn't quite what I wanted to look like with the pistachio color underneath, so then I had to change that and kind of mix my own green. So then eventually, once I had mixed for a while, I cut all of that out, of course. I ended up at this kind of medium-ish green, which seemed much more suiting to go with the pistachio color. And then I did use my pencil lines as a rough guideline, but I also tried to randomize it some to kind of give it a cartoony look, because realism is not really my strong suit, and I don't really want to try painting a fruit to start out with, especially not one with such crazy lines if I was going to do realism. I was pretty happy with it at this point, but then after a little while, my lines started getting slightly too thick, which I did have to clean up later, unfortunately. But I do think it all turned out well in the end. You know how when you cut a watermelon, like the inside of the rind has those lines? Like, I don't know how to describe it, but you can kind of see I was trying to mimic it, which was also turning out in an obviously cartoonish way. So after I had completed that, I then painted the seeds. After painting the seeds, I was looking back at those lines, and that's when I came to the realization that a lot of them were too thick. So I tidied those up with the pistachio color and was much happier with the result. Then I moved on to Mod Podging the shell, not the watermelon inside, but just the shell, because I wanted to protect that paint job that I had worked really long on. It's obviously cut a lot, so you can't really tell how long it was in reality, but it did take a good long time to get all of that. At this point, I moved on to the hinge, and I used a fake leaf that I yanked off a wreath that I had saved in my craft stash, and I kind of drew a rough sketch of a watermelon leaf on it, and then cut it out. After cutting it out, I did try to paint it a little bit because I wasn't happy with the color, and then I discovered, well, you know what, I went to all that struggle, but the leaf is too small and won't work as a hinge. I mean, I can say that looking back now, but at the time I wasn't quite sure and was trying to deny the fact that it was probably too small, even though I knew in my heart of hearts. So I did try to Elmer's glue it on and rubber band it, and I did that several times until I finally accepted the fact that it just wasn't going to work. So I did what I knew I should have done all along, and taking another fake leaf, I traced the original leaf onto it and cut it out in order to make a leaf that was bigger and would hopefully be able to hold the two halves of the walnut shell together effectively. So I glued it on using rubber bands to make sure that it stayed in place where I wanted, and then because I was still in denial about that first leaf being essentially useless and a waste of time in the beginning, I used it as decoration, even though it did literally nothing for the design. So I glued that on as well. And in case you were wondering, I switched to fabric glue because Elmer's glue also just wasn't holding the leaves effectively, which made me sad because I felt like Elmer's failed me. And of course, I wasn't happy with the way the leaves looked color-wise. They just weren't popping and doing it for me. So I brought out all the green paint in my stash and tried to fix that up. All that you see here on camera eventually did get changed, but at that point, I thought it was fine, so I Mod Podged the interior of the watermelon. And then at that point, I just decided I wasn't happy with the leaves, so I fixed them off camera, and this is what they ended up as in the end. And at that point, I was done with the watermelon shell, so it was time to begin on the mouse. I pulled out my polymer clay tin. Let's not talk about how messy that is. I do get a bit chaotic with the polymer clay, as you can see, and slightly careless, but I did end up pulling out all of the browns and whites to mix this kind of, I don't know, unbaked bread dough kind of color, which I was planning on using for the mouse. For some reason, mixing polymer clay always takes me a really long time. Maybe I just have weak fingers, or maybe I'm just indecisive with the colors that I want, but I did eventually end up with the right color. I feel like the sculpting for this project is pretty self-explanatory, so I will give my voice a break and give you a break from having to listen to it. I'm back. So at this point, after I had let the mouse cool, I just had to paint a couple of the little features on it, like the pink inner ears, and the nose and eyes and whiskers. And at this point, I decided I wasn't quite happy with the way the mouse was sitting, so using a pencil, I kind of marked out where his body was, and then I basically did the same thing I did in the beginning of the project. I took out the floral foam, and using little chunks of it, I kind of outlined that area so that the mouse would then be a little more set up, I guess. And then I just took my clay tools like I did before, and you kind of used it to chew it up so that the texture would be the same as the rest of the watermelon. So I pretty much just finished things up. I painted some red on the mouse's paws and face to make it look like he had been eating. And then I painted the floral foam red and added the black seeds, and after it was dry, I Mod Podged it to be sure it was all cohesive. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed what I made. Have a great day and God bless.